Well, good morning. We are starting in the text this morning. 1 Samuel chapter 1 through 3 is what we'll strive to cover, depending on how we get through these questions. I want to start with the very first one, and I want to kind of set the tone for these questions, and I did that more so in the next lesson as I sent out yesterday, and I'll have some printed copies by the end of the assembly in the back there. But these questions that I've asked, I really want to zone in, focus on the overview of these passages, and specifically what these stories, what this narrative, what the characters, the things that they say, the things that they do, how that plays out in the big picture of the exile. And that's how, in my studies, that's how I see Samuel, the narrator, dealing with these individuals. Excuse me. He is emphasizing the things that they do and they say for a purpose. It's not random. It's not, hey, I need a couple of good stories to start off this book that I'm writing, the story that I'm writing. No, there's reason for those stories being there, and those reasons ultimately point to something bigger, and it's supposed to teach Israel something. So what I want you to do when you're answering these questions is, okay, put yourself in the perspective of, I am in Babylonian captivity. I'm wondering why we are here. Is it because God is not faithful to us? He has abandoned us? He doesn't love us? Or is it something else? And what I believe Samuel is doing, and as we'll get into the Kings and Chronicles as well, what I believe Samuel is doing is he's showing it was you. And here is what led to the exile. And these stories then help us put ourselves in that perspective of, okay, what is God doing with Hannah? What is God doing with Eli, this high priest, and his sons who are corrupt? How does that have to do with, or what does that do with the exile? And I think it's important then that if we approach it from that standpoint, then what we don't do is we don't come to these stories and say, okay, I need a sermon on parenting, so let me go to Eli and his sons. Now, obviously, we can learn a lot about parenting from how Eli deals with his sons, but that's not the point of that account. That's not the point of why the author includes Eli and his vile, corrupt sons and how he doesn't restrain them. Or if I am a mother, or a woman rather, who is barren and I really want a child, maybe if I go and I devote myself like Hannah and I pray like Hannah, maybe God will open my womb. Well, we can certainly pray for those things and desire those things because that's natural. That's what God intended for one man, one woman to create a family. But that's not the point of 1 Samuel 1 and Hannah's barrenness. There's another point that he's making, and that has to do with the exile. And so what we have to do as readers is say, okay, what does her barrenness have to do with the exile? What does Samuel coming along have to do with that? How does that help us to see it through that lens, to see it in a corporate sense, meaning the nation, the community? Yes, the story is about individuals, but what does it have to do about the community? How do those individuals play out in benefit or bring shame upon the community? So think about that as we're summarizing these chapters, as we're going through these questions. In 3 to 4 sentences, summarize chapters 1 through 3. How would you handle this section of Scripture?
I have, as you mentioned already, a barren woman who pleads for a child from God and promises that if he does so, if he grants that request, she will dedicate him to the Lord. follows through on his request, or he grants her request and she follows through on her vow. And some irony that puts him in the company of, in the service of, a fellow who would fit right in with the church in Laodicea because of his lukewarmness and his corrupt sons. And yet, as we frequently see, here's this child who is going to prophesy their downfall.
Okay. Anyone else? Anybody else want to summarize what they saw in the text? Yes, sir.
I think we see some of the covenant curses of Deuteronomy coming upon them and the corruption of the priesthood,
Yes.
which points to the need of, the request for a king, but that is still failing to see God as the king that should be over them.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so what we have is what has already been talked about is you do have Hannah, you've got her praying for this child, but really it is Hannah is receiving this child because she is meeting God in the overarching will of God. She's praying, she's requesting this, but that is His will. This is what He wants. This is the right time to send Israel a leader who is going to renew their faithfulness and lead them to that, or at least lead them to the kings who, again, are supposed to do that, as we learned in our introduction from Deuteronomy chapter 17. All this is happening to Hannah ultimately to bless God's people. And so we need to keep that in mind. Also in chapter 2, you're going to see this played out with Hannah's prayer, as well as her, how God blesses her and how God condemns Eli and his sons with the idea of He's going to honor those who honor Him, and He's going to bring low those who dishonor Him. And so what we need to see then is Hannah represents a faithful Israel. And if you are loyal like Hannah, then you are going to be honored by God. If you dishonor God with your behavior, with your mindset, and you don't love Him, you're not loyal to Him, well then you are going to be like Eli, who ultimately represents corrupt Israel, a corrupt priesthood, a failing priesthood. And so you do see that contrast between Hannah, who is barren, who then becomes fruitful, and then Israel, who should be fruitful but becomes barren. And that is through the corruption of the priesthood. Okay, how does the text connect us to the time of the judges? Now, we kind of started this question in the introduction, but I wanted to focus in a little more on this because in the first 3 chapters, there's going to be a lot of connections to Judges, and I think that helps set the historical context, what's going on, helps us to, as the reader, to get back into that mindset of, okay, here's Judges. That's still playing out. That whole narrative is still playing out, but we're starting to shift. We're going to be going again from the Judges to a more centralized, a monarch, and it's not going to be chaos. It's not going to be a society without a king, everyone doing what's right in their own eyes, but rather it's going to be everyone is unified under one king who is blessing the nation through the Torah. So how does the text connect us to the time of the Judges? What are some things that you saw in the text?
Well, you have the last 2 judges in Eli, who was a very corrupt judge. Samuel comes on the scene as a righteous judge who transitions us into the kings, and he anoints the first and second kings of Israel.
Okay, and I do like the little detail that the author of Samuel adds, that they did not know God. And that should bring it back to Judges. There was a generation that arose who did not know God. And the idea really is that they had no regard for God, no regard for His authority, for His commandments. And that's specifically played out in the way that they treated the sacrifices, how they brought shame and corruption to the temple, or rather not the temple, but the the place there in Shiloh. And so you've got that connection there. What else?
You mentioned that the tabernacle was still there in Shiloh. Later on in the scriptures, obviously we have the explicit fact that gets moved to Jerusalem. Later on, we discovered that Shiloh was essentially allowed to languish or lay waste. So that, at least, we don't know exactly when it falls, it brings us back closer to the period of the Judges, even if we don't know quite clearly.
Okay. Anyone else? A couple of things that I saw was in 1 Samuel chapter 1, yep, I'm in chapter 3, no wonder. There was a certain man. So that phrase, there was a certain man, you see that with the same beginnings of the stories of Samson and Micah there in Judges chapter 13 as well as 17. So you've got that same kind of just opening expression of there was a certain man, tying these two time periods together. I think it's also interesting, you step back from just what the text says in 1 Samuel to just maybe the contrast that you see within the individual. So you have Micah's mother, who, if you remember, she's obsessed with idols, but you have Samuel's mother, who is wholeheartedly devoted to God. And so you've got those contrasts going on right there. You have Samson, who was born to a mother who was once barren, and then you have Samuel that was also born, and one of them exhibits this moral failure, weakness. The other one, again, wholehearted devotion to God. You've got Samson and you've got Samuel, who are Nazarites. Well, as far as Samuel, it's never said in the text explicitly that he was a Nazarite, but Hannah does in her vow say, hey, no razor will touch his head. That kind of brings us back to that Nazarite vow, which we know that Samson was under, and he also had that lifelong service. So you've got just the characters themselves are showing the contrast there between Judges and the opening of Samuel. Then you've also got, in chapter 3 and verse 1, I think another contrast that we see going on now. The young boy Samuel was ministering to Yahweh before Eli, and word from Yahweh was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent. Why do you think the visions and the word of God was rare in those days?
They weren't listening anyway.
Sir?
They weren't listening anyway.
Correct. God wasn't speaking to them. There wasn't revelation due to the fact that they were corrupt. But interesting contrast, as we'll see in the text, where God stops speaking through this corrupt priesthood, and this time, rare in those days, then is going to begin to speak through Samuel, who is faithful, loyal, and humble, and so on. So you just got some different connections there to the book of Judges. It helps us then as the readers say, okay, this was a corrupt society. The culture was totally gone as far as the Jewish people were concerned. Yes, sir?
Well, Elkanah even told his wife, do what is good in your own eyes, or in your eyes, which ties back to that phrase that we keep mentioning from Judges.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, all right. Now, name some contrast in the text. For example, the faithful worship of Elkanah's wife versus the vain worship of Eli's son. And I've added this particular question that I should have added on the paperwork, and that is, what is the purpose of these contrasts? And if you read chapters 1 through 3, the author gives us a lot of contrast. And you're like, man, he's just over and over between characters, between words that are being said, between themes. There's just so many contrasts going on. What are they? What is the purpose of these contrasts?
It's showing the difference between those who are faithful to the Lord and the blessings that come, and those who are wicked and who meet God's
Yes, that is, I think that's the main point, absolutely. Anything else?
I think it's interesting, the first chapter, just looking at the names Penina, the other wife of Elkanah, her name would mean jewel or pearl, something precious, but it's clearly Hannah is the one that's treasured.
Favored, yes. Absolutely. And that's, what Hannah means is favored. And so she is the favored one. He's given her the double portion, which under the law, the firstborn was supposed to have the double portion, things like that. So, you definitely see that. What else?
You also see the contrast of honor, that Eli is really more or less honoring his sons over God versus Hannah, who's going to honor God over everybody else.
Yes. And you see that with the sons in general as well. You've got Samuel, who is devoted to the Lord, Eli's sons, who is not. Hannah selflessly devotes her son. Eli's sons selfishly take from the Lord, whereas Samuel is devoted to the Lord. We've already seen the one where God is silent when it comes to the corrupt, but God is speaking through the faithful. So I think really, my mind just went blank. Brother in the back. Oh, Brother Sam, I apologize, brother. Just totally slipped my mind. I think you hit the nail on the head, though, is that these readers who are exiled, they're seeing there's the difference between, and this is a lesson that they should have learned of, okay, here is all of these things happening when they are faithful to the covenant compared to here's all the things happening when they are disobedient to the Torah. So as you read through that, I would encourage you, notice there's several different connections and contrasts that the author is making there. So here's another one as far as stepping back, going broader. What are the similarities and differences between Elkanah and Hannah and Abraham and Sarah? And adding to that, what is God teaching by highlighting another barren woman story in Israel's history?
Just before we leave the last question, I think there's a very strong contrast between Hannah and Peninnah as well. There's a lesson there for people, whether they're in Babylon or just everyday life, that here's one person that trusted in the Lord, and he took care of her, and she was dependent on him, but then here was somebody else who was looking to the flesh, whether it was many children or much wealth and resources, and that's a huge part of Israel's downfall. At the end of the day, their trust was not in the Lord. It was in their numbers, their resources, their people, all the other things. And so there's a huge lesson just in looking at these two women that the writer calls rivals.
Yes. And she is oppressing Hannah, and yet here's Hannah who's maintaining her faithfulness to God, which then shows Israel, especially when they're being oppressed. They've already been through this whole cycle of the judges of sin, oppression, deliverance, over and over again, but then also the Egyptian bondage where they were just caught up in this oppression, and yet what God is showing is here's an individual who maintains faithfulness despite hardship, despite what the outside externals look like, and despite the oppression, she's still maintaining faithfulness. You have no excuse. You could have maintained this faithfulness as well. Go ahead.
I'm also going to piggyback on that, another contrast before we get to Abraham and Sarah. You have, I know you said that people were corrupt, and they were, and yet the worst corruption was in the priesthood.
Yes.
Because when they would come and take the sacrifices before they had been roasted, the people would say, aren't we supposed to do something different? And so here you have the common people who are not necessary. They're supposed to know the law, but they should not be the most familiar with it. They should not be the ones who are following it the closer. And they're advising the priests. We see that so many times throughout the scripture. The adults in the room should have been the generation that came out of Egypt, but their children were the ones who were the adults and took the land. When you get to the point of Ezekiel, who were the very worst, the priests worshiping idols in their own temple. When you get to the time of Jesus, who were the very worst, it's the priests and the Sadducees. Whereas the common people, they recognize Jesus. So have two things that come about in those days, judgment and then a Savior arises.
Right. And to your point about the people being corrupt, I think that what Hannah represents is there's always a remnant. And she's just one of many who are still being faithful in the time of Judges. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, what are the similarities and differences between these husband and wife as far as what we see with Abraham and Sarah, and then what we see with Elkanah and Hannah? What do you think those differences are, similarities, and what does that have to do with the story?
Well, they were both barren until God intervened through providence and gave them children that were children of promise and children that led God's people back to Him, in a sense.
Okay. Why do you think then God, or the author here, which ultimately is God, but why do you think the author here is bringing up this story here, and why do you think we should make that connection with that story in the Torah? What is God ultimately trying to teach Israel by having all of these stories? Because they're not the only two stories of barren women. You have others, but what is the point?
One may be His sovereignty. You have this woman who shouldn't have passed childbearing years. God says, no, it's not your maidservant who's going to have this son. You're going to have this son. And so He is choosing where the promise and how the promise will be fulfilled. Same sort of thing here with Hannah and Samuel. So here is this woman who had several children, it sounds like. No. The special one is right here. Well, let me stop before I get into your next question.
No, you're fine. I think the sovereignty is dead on. I mean, I think it's the idea of God is showing Israel, just like Hannah prays in chapter 2, He kills, He makes alive. And there's nothing impossible for the Lord, number one. But number two is He's always going to care for His people. And in this sense, what He does is He cares for His people in bringing about His people through Isaac, through the seed of Abraham. But then He also cares for His people by bringing about Samuel, and what He's going to do to bring about a king who's ultimately going to bless God's covenant people. And so, God's sovereignty is there, and He's showing Israel, look, you're exiled right now, you're going through all these things, and yet remember these stories. Remember what God did to Abraham and Sarah. Remember how God chose Hannah and dealt with Hannah, who was loyal to Him. God will do the same to you if you are loyal to Him. All right, anything else on Abraham and Sarah? Any other similarities? Yes.
Well, you have Sarah, who is barren for the first major part of her life when they're in Babylon, Chaldea, and then they come to the land and she's still barren until they try to go through the flesh, and then that creates an irritant and annoyance, very similar to Peninnah irritating and annoying Hannah, and it leads to heartache until that trust that you pointed out that leads to God intervening and doing those things. But I think, and this may go beyond your question, but that does seem to point to something that the exiles needed to hear, because in the time of the Judges, you've got Samson's mother who was barren, now you've got Hannah who was barren in the time of the Judges. God had promised that if they were faithful, they would never be barren. And now there's barrenness. And then you have Isaiah coming along and saying, in exile, it's almost like you're barren, Israel, but I'm going to bring you back to Zion.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some similarities in faith in Abraham, faith in Hannah, and faith in Israel. God's going to take away their barrenness.
Yes. And I had the Isaiah passage in my notes, so that means it was not beyond my question. So, but no, I think you're right on that. And He is showing, and ultimately for Hannah's sake here, He's showing Israel, look, you may be suffering, because there was a remnant who suffered, but they didn't suffer because of covenant unfaithfulness. Because they were faithful to God, and yet the nation as a whole was not. So here are individuals who are righteous, and yet they are suffering, and God is going to take care of them. He's going to care for them. He's going to lift them up out of their poverty, as Hannah prays in her prayer. And that's what he does with Sarah, with Hannah, and so on. But yeah, great points there, brother. All right. Yes.
One other thing that I thought of was Hannah and Abraham were willing to give up what God gave them.
Yes.
In order to receive the blessing. And I think that there's a similarity there. They were willing to give their child sacrifices in the case of Abraham.
Right.
And God blessed them tremendously because of their devotion to Him.
What's interesting about that, though, is Abraham, and not to say that Abraham would not have been willing to do it, but Abraham was told to do it. Hannah willingly did it. And there is a contrast there. Her barrenness, the sacrifice of Abraham was his test. Or excuse me, the sacrifice of Isaac was his test. Whereas the barrenness on her part was the test. Will she remain loyal to God despite not having children, despite the oppression and so on? I think it's also interesting that, she's, I think maybe going back to something Marshall was saying, she is barren, but she's being oppressed like Hagar. So you see that contrast there. But yeah, good stuff there. Anything else? All right, so ultimately, what is the purpose of highlighting these stories? It is so that Israel sees that God is going to make fruitful those who are loyal. All right, the text stresses that Yahweh had closed her womb, and we probably dealt some of this with his other questions, but what does this reveal about God's sovereign purpose in Hannah's life and Israel's history? Anybody want to add anything to that besides the things that we've already discussed, where our brother here went into my next question? I'm kidding. Anything else you would like to add? Yes.
Thinking about that sovereign purpose, this also does seem to point forward to a barren woman is going to bear John the Baptist, who is going to bring about the anointed king. So,
correct.
Maybe there's the overlapping stories, but I won't go too far into that.
No, you're fine. I just think that as far as answering this, what does this reveal about God's sovereign purpose in Hannah's life and in Israel's history? I think ultimately, by God closing her womb, what he's doing is he's refining her faith. He's testing her. He's helping guide her to seek him. And that is exactly what the exile nation needed to do. During the exile, part of that whole process was to refine the faith. It was to weed out, so to speak, so that the remnant was the one that was on the other side of that, would come out of that exile. They would be glorified. They would be honored. They were the ones who were faithful. And so their faith is being refined. They, within the exile, as they're contemplating why they are there and what is going on, they begin to seek, at least the honest and true ones, they begin to seek Yahweh. And that's what Hannah is doing during her test here as well. So, all right, anything else on that?
I think Abraham is a similar kind of example from the Torah. You have this man who is brought to the realization, I don't have an heir. You told me you're going to bless me, but I don't have an heir of my own flesh and blood. And so creating that longing and creating that dependency.
Yes.
And I like the word refined that you used there. God is purifying what's already there, or is perhaps magnifying what's already there. Of course, we have the opposite example. It's like Pharaoh. God's just magnifying what's already there, and creating a circumstance where who he really is comes out in the most spectacular way.
Absolutely. Okay, what do Eli's mistake in judging Hannah's prayer as drunkenness, 1 Samuel 1, 12 through 14, and the detailed sins of his sons, chapter 2, 12 and 17, reveal about the spiritual state at Shiloh? Why does God ultimately hold Eli accountable for the corruption? What are your thoughts?
I kind of get the impression that these feast days have become something like Mardi Gras. And so here's Eli, who has still something of a veneer of what ought to be proper there. What do you mean to be look around? I get the impression she wasn't so that's the reason he was so quick to jump to that
Yeah.
conclusion. At the very same time, he was a poor judge of character, and that he could so quickly judge her, but be completely oblivious to what his sons were doing.
Right. I do, yeah, that was my question too when I was going through the text is, why does he jump on her for drunkenness unless that's an issue? I mean, has he seen that before? I mean, are they that corrupt? I mean, or is he thinking about all the things that he's heard about his son, about how they lay with women and, how they take up the sacrifice, all that corruption going on. And so it just shows so much spiritual decline, moral decline, things like that. But I think it's interesting that in chapter 3, I know it's in chapter 3 somewhere, it talks about how Eli is coming to a point where he is blind. Verse 2, now his eyesight had begun to fade, and he could not see well. By chapter 4, it's going to say he could not see at all. So he essentially becomes completely blind. And I think that one of the things that the author is doing here with Eli, you've got this idea of physical blindness, just increasing with Eli with age. But all the while, he's been spiritually blind. And, he's blind to what his sons are doing. He's blind to what the corruption is going on at Shiloh. He's just blind about everything. He's in the dark, so to speak. And he misjudges Hannah's pouring out of her heart to God. I mean, he is, like you said, a poor judge. That's what he is. He was supposed to be a judge that led with righteousness, and yet he is a poor judge. So I think you've got that physical blindness going on, but also there's this application of spiritual blindness on Eli's part as well.
I think there is a possibility that the other side of him is not that he was blind in the sense he couldn't see the evil that his sons were doing.
Sure.
The other side could be that because of the statement when he asked Samuel to say, speak what God said, don't spare my feelings, because I think he knew where God's statement was going to be in some way.
Yes.
And so there's the other side where I know it's wrong, I just can't bring myself to bear to deal with it. I can do the other stuff as a priest, but I can't deal with my own children, or I'm not going to at least be principled enough to deal with that.
And, to your point about he knew, he had the unidentified prophet came and spoke to him. I mean, he saw this was coming. This judgment was coming upon him. But even then, in that sense, you see that he's in the dark about the voice of God. He doesn't recognize that God is speaking to Samuel. And I do see a sense in which Eli, because it starts off in the chapter 3 of the voice of God was rare in those days. Visions were rare in those days. God's not speaking to Eli, so he doesn't even recognize that God is speaking to Samuel. I mean, this is how, and that's what I mean by spiritual blind. This is how blind he becomes and how distant he becomes to what is going on and what he is supposed to be doing. Anything else? Yes?
Just piggybacking off what Leonard said, in 2:22 it says all these things came to his ears. So
Yes.
he knew about it, and we also see him correcting his sons, but we're told that he still preferred them over the Lord because he didn't restrain them. And I think the implication is when you look at the rebuke of him, it says that there will be nobody left in his household. They'll come begging for bread and for a piece of silver just so they can serve as priests.
Yes.
So Eli always had the option that he could put his sons out of that position of power and doing evil, but yet he preferred them over the Lord and made sure they were taken care of. So the point here is he could have done more. He did rebuke them, he did tell them it was evil, but in the end, he didn't do all that he could do, and the condemnation was that he loved his children more than the Lord.
Right.
And that's a good lesson for us. It's a good lesson for those that were in captivity. Why did they get there? Is it because they were more concerned about taking care of their children than putting the Lord first?
Yeah. Amen. He should have removed them from office. And so what God does is he says, okay, you've been taken, so I'm going to do the reverse of that. And there's a lot of reversals in these 3 chapters as well. I'm going to do the reverse of that, and now you're going to be begging, instead of taking by force. All right. Anything else on that?
Point about the blindness, somebody's observed that in 3 John, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. Is that a blessing or a curse to you? And in Eli's case, he was in health as his soul was prospering, which of course was not very well. And also, I think we have an echo here, or we're going to see an echo of this with Saul and David. There's going to come a time when Saul was seeking for input from God, and God will not talk to him.
Yes.
It's still talking to David.
And that's part of my last question here. How do the characters help us think about corporate Israel, God's people or, as a nation or community as a whole? You've got Eli who's being rejected. That foreshadows Saul's rejection. And God's not talking to Eli. God's not talking to Saul. That's going to foreshadow Israel's rejection, where God completely cuts them off. And so you've got all these characters who are ultimately pointing to bigger parts of the story, and that's where we've got to come in and figure out, okay, how do these all tie together? Anything else with the remaining time we've got? Yes, sir.
At the very end of chapter 3 tells us, in verse 19, thus Samuel grew, and Yahweh was with him, and let none of the words fall to the ground. So all of Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of Yahweh. And Yahweh appeared again at Shiloh, because Yahweh revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of Yahweh. So it's almost, these exiles are hearing this and almost seeing that Israel was living in exile away from God because God had left Shiloh because of the corruption. And now God has returned. That might give them some comfort as well. Even
Yes.
Israel at this time was, in a sense, in spiritual exile.
All right. Yes, sir.
Eli also was benefiting from his, I think we're going to have to say that he was benefiting from what his sons were doing, because when he dies, it's mentioned he was heavy. Well, they were getting plenty of food from the sacrifices, and I don't think he was refusing.
I think that's a valid point. Anything else? Perfect timing. There we go. Thank you, guys.